Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Systems Change Deep Dive podcast, where we take a systemic look at topics that we believe have great potential to catalyze systems change. For this first season, we are going to be looking into the issue of carbon capture and hearing from the people who are working on different solutions and different approaches to carbon capture. For the first episode, we are talking to Niklas Kaskeala from Compensate, a nonprofit addressing the current voluntary carbon market from within. Niklas Kaskeala is Compensate's Chief Impact Officer. He oversees Compensate's sustainability approach, carbon capture portfolio, and advocacy efforts to reform the voluntary carbon market. He's also the founder of Protect Our Winters Finland, the Finnish affiliate of the international Protect Our Winters movement, and he has a really long background in several environmental and development NGOs. He has more than 15 years of experience in development, sustainability, and climate change. And before joining Compensate, which was in the summer of 2019, he worked with the crisis management initiative Save the Children and the global development expert Fingo. Welcome, Niklas. Thank you so much for accepting to be here today on our podcast. I would like to start the interview by asking you to explain briefly why you were drawn to do this type of work with Compensate.
Okay. Well, thanks for having me on the podcast. It's a pleasure to be here. Actually, there's a story involved how I got to work at Compensate. The founder, his name is Antero Vartija. He's a former member of parliament here in Finland. So Compensate is a Finnish foundation that Antero has started, and Antero reached out to me a few months before the public launch of the foundation back in 2019. And I had been very critical about offsetting and, the use of carbon credits. I worked in civil society basically all my career or my life, and in development and environmental organizations, and have seen myself like carbon projects in the global south, and seen also how they are not necessarily like delivering on what they should be delivering. And I was very critical about this new initiative, but Antero nevertheless invited me to a big launch event at the University of Helsinki here in Finland. It was the main hall at the university, 500 people attended. I attended, and actually I got really angry about a few things that he said, and later on I was sitting on the metro riding home, and I had to hop off a few stops before my home stop to write him an email to say that, hey, in your speech you got this and this wrong. A few weeks later he offered me a job and say, like, instead of criticizing, you should join and make sure that we do things right. So that's how I ended up working for something that I probably didn't imagine doing before, and here I am trying to challenge the way offsetting should be done, and challenging existing standards on the carbon market. So that was like 3 years ago, and now we're here.
Yeah, that's such an interesting story of getting involved in something that it's a very proactive and constructive way of approaching the problem, I suppose. One of the things that you mentioned in Compensate has compiled a white paper about the voluntary carbon market, which is really interesting, and we'll link it in the descriptions. One of the things that you mentioned there is that the current carbon market is riddled with greenwashing. So I'd like to ask you, what are the main ways that you can see greenwashing happening in this field of carbon markets?
Yeah, very large question, but I'll try to maybe answer it the main issues. So yeah, we wrote a white paper and released it last spring, where we showcase how we had analyzed over 100 nature-based carbon projects from around the world, with some of the leading voluntary standards, international carbon standards. And we have a scientific advisory panel with which we had created a criteria to evaluate these nature-based projects. And when we started using this criteria, we immediately saw that a lot of projects failed to meet our criteria. And when we first we thought, okay, maybe it's just like we're just looking at bad projects. There are good ones out there, but we started to realize now, no, this is more like a systemic flaw. And so after we'd gone through 100 and seen that only 10% pass our evaluation process, and even the ones that pass our evaluation process, we still have to do what we call overcompensation to mitigate some of the risks left in the project. So we just wanted to, publish this white paper and say that, hey, this market has some fundamental issues. If 90% of what should be good quality projects, like according to existing standards, don't meet the what we would consider as basic requirements for a good quality project. So there are several reasons why projects fail. The most prominent reason is the lack of additionality, which is really a very, very crucial aspect of a good carbon project or a good carbon credit. Basically, if you don't have additionality, the buyer of the carbon credit is paying for something that would have happened in any place. And so it's you're paying for nothing, basically. And if you then use that carbon credit to offset emissions, so that you're making an equivalency to some emissions and you want to kind of neutralize them, using a non-additional carbon credit won't actually do that. The climate impact won't be there. So that's really, really something that is like one of the main qualities of a good carbon credit, and it's really tricky to establish that additionality. And that's one of the first things we look at. So that's why most projects basically that failed because of that reason. We don't necessarily, there's no point in evaluating these projects further where we've established that they're not additional. But then this criteria that we look at, that we have, also looks at biodiversity of the projects, biodiversity impacts, and also the social impacts of the projects, as well as how the so-called carbon accounting is arranged under the Paris Agreement, and making sure that there's not what's called double counting. So other reasons for projects failing could be harmful biodiversity impacts, plantation type of tree plantations that use pesticides and things like that. Or then you can have negative social impacts where it's unclear how much of the impact or the revenue from sale of carbon credits flows back to local communities. You might have even forced evictions from project areas, like community conflicts, all kinds of things. So this criteria is quite holistic in that sense. It looks at different aspects, and then we have that result that 9 out of 10 projects unfortunately failed. So that says something about nature-based projects, which is a majority of the projects out there on the carbon market. So. But we didn't look at other project types, although they are problematic for other reasons as well. So, but that was the focus of our white paper.
So I also want to ask you about the issue. A lot of people are worried about offsetting and all of these problems with greenwashing and with current carbon standards, because as you mentioned yourself, the projects that you evaluated, they all were verified by international standards. And there's a lot of people that are afraid that offsetting prices aren't encouraging people to actually reduce emissions. So what's your take on that? How do you feel? Do you feel that there's potential for to offset and still reduce emissions? Or do you feel that it's very difficult?
Well, first of all, I think it's good to remind everyone listening that absolutely the most crucial thing in fighting the climate crisis is radical emission reductions. And use of offsets should always be the last option. Either you're a company thinking about how you take climate action, or an individual or institution or whatever, you should never, start by thinking, how can I offset emissions? You need to radically reduce emissions, think about how you can avoid them, how you can minimize them. And then the last option on the table is our carbon credits. And then you need to make sure that you use good quality credits and you're transparent about that. So I think like if you take this approach that you like if let's say you're a company and you align your emission reduction targets along with like what is required under the Paris Agreement to reach 1.5 degrees. We have initiatives like the science-based targets where corporates can align themselves with Paris Agreement targets, and you make sure that you also implement those emission reduction objectives, and you have like a sort of a trajectory towards reaching as close to possible zero emissions. Then I think on top of that, you can also take responsibility for those emissions that you still cause today, maybe tomorrow, maybe next year, maybe 5 years from now, because you're not going to get to zero in a second. It'll take some time, but as long as you make sure that your emission reductions are in line with our global climate targets, then on top of that, you can take responsibility for those emissions that you're still causing. And well, you can and you should, I think. I think it's a like moral obligation that we should have, all of us, is to take responsibility for our actions. And we're dumping carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere that's already full of them. What gives us the right to add even more when it's already full? It's like an invisible dump site that just we can't see, but it's already overflowing. What gives us the right to add anything more if we don't clean up after ourselves? It's not like we every day go and throw trash into the park, or maybe some people do, I don't. But if I were to drop something, I would pick it up. We should treat the emissions we cause the same way that we obviously don't want to throw trash in the park, but if we do it by mistake or like for whatever reason, then we're responsible for cleaning it up. That carbon dioxide that we're adding into the atmosphere is causing so much trouble already, so many problems. We should have that mentality that we don't increase that CO2 level in the atmosphere at all. The main way to do that is reducing emissions, but because you can't get to zero emissions immediately, then you should take responsibility for them. And you can use the carbon markets there, but you really need to be careful. You need to kind of look at these projects really closely and make sure you find the best ones.
So about finding good projects, you have already mentioned a couple of things. You've already mentioned that they have to be additive, that they should respect the local communities and biodiversity. What are other characteristics that are important when choosing carbon offsetting projects?
Yeah, I think the additionality obviously is one of, if you're using them to make an offset claim, or like even if you're not, you want to pay for something that is happening because of that reason, because of the removing the carbon or sequestering the carbon. Let me give you an example of we see a lot of projects that are like commercial plantation type projects where you just plant fast growing biomass like eucalyptus trees and whatever, and they're harvested after 20 years and sold to the timber industry. It puzzle, like I fail to understand how this is additional, because there is obviously a business model, and it's a business. Why would I pay for some person who, or a company that has a business running a plantation? It doesn't really compute with me why I should do that. Or let's say renewable energy projects. They could have been additional like some 10, 15 years from now, ago. But nowadays it's already extremely competitive. It's the cheapest form of energy in many places. Why would we support renewable energy projects through the carbon markets? They don't need that support anymore. So basically, if I were to support them, I would be paying for something that would happen any place. And then you need to also look at, we go further than just this additionality analysis. We'll look at policy additionality. So we make sure that there are no government or international policies in place that are already driving these changes, so that we can really make sure that they're additional. But other qualities, I think, especially one of the big risks with these nature-based projects is the permanence of the carbon. and you need to understand and sort of that is a huge risk, and you try to mitigate for it. Obviously, it's impossible to have full guarantees that carbon will be stored in some kind of biomass for more than maybe some decades or hundreds of years at max. It's just impossible to have any certainty on that, but you can take measures to mitigate those risks as well. Like we've done some things which is called overcompensation, where we buy or use more carbon credits than would be technically necessary to offset a certain amount of emissions, so that we make sure that we do more than would be necessary to achieve a 1-to-1 ratio of offsetting. So permanence is thing, and that can be related to other risks, like political risks or natural risks. We've seen forest fires that destroy some of these forests that are being used to create carbon offsets or credits. There are mechanisms also to mitigate those risks by buffering carbon credits and making sure that if something happens somewhere else, we have a buffer pool of credits that haven't been used yet, and those can be released. So there are different ways also to mitigate risk, but I think acknowledging the risks is really, really important, and that also stresses the primary function of emission reductions, because if you reduce emissions, it's real, right? There are no risks. You've avoided adding CO2 into the atmosphere. But when you use carbon credits, there are always these risks involved, and you need to kind of make sure that you understand them well, and maybe also communicate them to your stakeholders, your customers, or whoever, so that you're not creating a false image of not having any climate impact, negative climate impact.
One other thing that I would like to pursue, something that you mentioned briefly, is that your analysis focused on nature-based projects. Why did you kind of default to analyzing the solutions?
Well, first of all, I think the way we have been focusing on nature-based projects is that a lot of the other project types have been somehow related to use of renewable energy, and we don't see that as anymore something that should be supported through the carbon markets. That change is already happening. Then some of the other non-nature-based technologies are not yet available at scale, so we don't have direct air capture, for example. There are a few machines here and there around the world that are already capturing carbon directly from the atmosphere, but it's very, 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 very small scale, and it won't scale in the next few years yet, and it might scale sometime in the future. But the most efficient and scalable technology that we have right now to sequester carbon or to remove carbon is biomass and storing carbon into biomass. So that's why we've really focused on those project types, even though it's also riddled with risks, that project type category basically. But you need to kind of navigate those risks and minimize them. But what we also do is we have this portfolio of projects, and yeah, most of them are nature-based, but we also support 20% of our offset payments are directed to what we call innovative carbon capture solutions. So we have, for example, biochar projects there, where biochar is produced and the carbon is stored for potentially hundreds of years in biochar that can then be used also as a soil improvement material, for example, or has many other uses as well. Or we have blue carbon projects which are also nature-based projects, but they're where we, for example, kelp is grown, and it's a very fast-growing type of biomass, and it sequesters a lot of carbon, and then it's dropped to the bottom of the deep sea, and it stays there for centuries, perhaps potentially even longer. So I think the way we've looked at the kind of carbon market is that, yeah, we need to find the best, let's call them traditional projects in a way, but then also support new emerging technologies that can, that we see as scalable. One other, like soil carbon, for example, if we were to, at large scale, transform our agricultural lands to regenerative agriculture, that would have like even a gigaton level climate impact, but we need to kind of incentivize and support that transformation. So carbon credits could play a role there, for example. And that's there are like projects popping up in the field of soil carbon as well, and they have a lot of problems. But we still think that we need to kind of support solving those existing problems by allocating some of our offset payments to these innovative solutions as well.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that perspective. I'd also like to ask you, so here at the Systems Change Alliance, we're all about taking a systemic look at problems and their solutions as well. And I would like to ask, so how can these projects affect the economy and society and culture even of the locations where they are being implemented?
Yeah, that's they can affect them many ways, and not all effects are unfortunately, not all of them have been positive in the past. I think let's take like a project type that is called avoided emissions from deforestation. So basically it means you're protecting forests that would be otherwise threatened by logging or other type of like cutting or other type of damage. From the like carbon perspective, this project type is super tricky to get right. It's extremely difficult to account for the like additional carbon that is protected in these forests, because it's kind of a what is called like a or you need to kind of have a imaginary baseline of what would have happened if the project didn't exist, and then you compare that to the project actually protecting the forest, and you can get it wrong in so many ways. And we've evaluated about 70 of these projects, and currently we've passed accepted 3. So, and most of the reasons are because of the really tricky, like why it's really it's so hard to get the kind of carbon accounting right in a way, or the carbon estimates right there. But why these projects are important is that they are actually quite often they are protecting the forest. It's just that they get the amount of CO2 wrong. But when they're protecting forest, they're protecting biodiversity as well, and they might be protecting like sustainable livelihoods as well at the same time. And or creating supporting the creation of alternative livelihoods that are not based on exploiting the forests, for example. So you can, or then you can have like community, like a lot of the most of the reforestation or afforestation projects that we've accepted are community based. So you have like communities themselves benefiting for the planting of trees, like let's say they're fruit trees or nut trees or others, where they can then use also to improve their livelihoods. They can, use, I mean, they can replace trees with like otherwise more harmful biomass that they would be using, and there are plenty of ways we can support livelihoods as well. But yeah, it's then you also need to make sure that the revenue from, if these projects create carbon credits and they create obviously the revenue, they should flow back to the local communities. And this is one of the problems of the market as well, is that it's extremely non-transparent in that sense. And we've been trying to work with these community-led projects that disclose how much revenue goes back to local communities. There can even be like direct cash payments to community members and so forth, so that they can actually like see the benefits of what they're doing. But then that's not always the case. Yeah, if you're a buyer of these credits, you should like ask who this, like the seller, that how much is your cut, how much is going to the project, how much is within the project going to the local community. If they're unable to answer, maybe you look at the next project, right? Or the next seller.
Thank you also for giving those those guidelines to everyone watching, to pay a little bit more attention and get a little bit more informed. One of the other things that you emphasize in the report, and that you've also already briefly mentioned here, is the issue of overcompensation. So why do you think that this is such an important part of the carbon offsetting field?
Well, maybe I need to explain what it means before I. So basically, on the carbon market, what is sold and bought are carbon credits, and each credit is in theory valued at 1 ton of CO2. So basically, if you're using the credit to offset emissions, let's say you cause 1 ton of emissions by taking a flight, and then, which you shouldn't do, by the way. You should always prefer other types of travel. But anyway, let's just, for the sake of conversation here, you cause 1 ton of emissions. In theory, you could buy 1 carbon credit to offset that ton of emissions. Now, the problem is that these credits are actually, the quality of them and their like true climate impact actually varies a lot, but it's not reflected in the value of the CO2, or the CO2 value of the credit. And what we've done is when we analyze the projects and we evaluate the projects before accepting them or failing them, we score them as well with this criteria that we've created. We have a scientific advisory panel who has, by the way, co-created this criteria with us so that we can evaluate these projects. It has some of the world's most renowned climate scientists on it. And with this criteria, we score each project, and we say that it's not actually, 1 credit is not worth 1 ton of CO2. It can be worth like 500 kilos instead of 1 ton. So we could say like it's a good project. Otherwise, it's like good for biodiversity. Local communities are well respected and they increase livelihoods. But it's just that maybe they haven't accounted for all the risks involved from the climate integrity perspective. So to mitigate that, we would then overcompensate, and we would buy 2 credits from this project in order to offset 1 ton of emissions. So that's what is overcompensation, the first layer of it. But then we add a second layer on top, because even if you were to find a perfect carbon credit and you can be 100% sure that it's worth 1 ton or the climate impact of it is 1 ton of CO2, if you were to offset with it, you're not affecting the carbon balance of the atmosphere. You're basically doing a 1-to-1 kind of ratio. You're not really solving that systemic problem that we have, where there is already too much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So we add another layer of overcompensation so that we can say that you've actually, through your action, taken out more carbon from the atmosphere than you've emitted. And then you're actually contributing to that systemic issue of where we need to reduce or take out the excess carbon dioxide that we already have in the atmosphere. And if I give you like an example, if you imagine the atmosphere being a bathtub, and the water that's in that bathtub is the CO2 or greenhouse gas emissions that we've caused into the atmosphere. We've basically had the tap on and the water running as humanity, like for decades or centuries. And what's happened is that the bathtub is already full and it's already overflowing. The water is running over the edges of that tub, and it's causing all kinds of damage. The same thing with the atmosphere. The tap for emissions has been on for so long that atmosphere is already so full of our greenhouse gases that it's like beyond safe limits. We passed the safe limit of CO2 concentration in the atmosphere back in the late 80s. And since then, we've just kept adding all the time more CO2. So the solution can't be anymore to just turn that tap off, basically. Same with the bathtub. If you just turn the tap off, you're still with the situation of dangerously high water level there, or like it will still spill over a bit. So you need to also take the plug out of the bottom of that bathtub and drain the excess water out. So the same thing with the emissions we're causing. We need to, like right now, what we're doing is we're just switching it slightly, closing that tub, the tap, and we're still adding actually to that like we're adding CO2 in the atmosphere all the time. So we need to squeeze it completely closed. Obviously, that unfortunately will take some time, but at the same time, we need to unplug that plug from the bottom. And when it comes to the atmosphere, we need to support or have more projects that sequester and remove carbon from the atmosphere that has already been accumulated there. So this way, now going back to overcompensation, when we go like beyond a traditional 1-to-1 ratio of offsetting or compensation, we're actually also then taking responsibility for those historic emissions that all of us, like as individuals or as companies have, or other institutions or organizations that we've caused during the past years. And we believe that that's absolutely necessary. There's like no point in doing it any other way.
Wonderful. So one last question that I have for you is to reform this, which is an endeavor indeed, to reform the carbon market and move it towards more transparency. What are your main recommendations and action points to achieve this together?
Good question. I think depends on who I would be speaking to. If you're a policymaker or a buyer of carbon credits or a project developer, I would have like slightly different answers. But I think like on a like general level, just acknowledging the flaws that the current market has to be the first step before like, and then building a better system like after that acknowledgement is like and that's what we've been trying to do. I mean, we've been very vocal about the flaws that the market has, but at the same time developing our unique way of kind of navigating that market, and through overcompensation, through very like close scrutiny of the projects and all that, making sure that we can still operate in that market. But obviously we need others to follow as well. I think we're going to need more regulation. In the EU, we have a proposal from the Commission to start regulating carbon removals more. All of these things are welcome. We need corporate responsibility standards like the science-based targets and others who are already taking like a good stance on how to make sure that we define the role offsetting has in corporate like climate action, so that it has the right role, so that it's we always emphasize the importance of emission reductions, and offsetting kind of has finds the right place in that whole picture. If you're a buyer of carbon credits, just like study. There are a lot of studies out there. Our white paper is probably something that's interesting to many. Read them, ask the right questions from the sellers of carbon credits. If they're unable to answer you, then maybe you don't buy from them, or if you're not satisfied with the answers. There are a lot of initiatives right now going on around to reform the market, and many of them are very like good initiatives. So get involved with them, contribute to them. Like a lot of them have open consultations where anybody can take part through, contribute with their views. So really like engage yourself. Yeah, so I don't know if that answers your question. Depends a bit on who we're talking to, but yeah, hope that's a good answer.
That is a great answer, as have been all of the answers in this interview. Thank you so much for joining us and for sharing this really systemic and in-depth view of the issue with carbon offsets and how we can move towards a more transparent market that actually helps reduce emissions. reduce the past emissions. And to everyone watching, if you are interested, you can find in the description a link to the Compensate report. So please do take a look at that. And if you are a concerned individual as well, Compensate has a really nice free app where you can calculate your carbon footprints, and you can take a look at the projects that they support that have passed all of this, very rigorous scrutiny. And finally, you can also offset the occasional flight and some of your day-to-day emissions. Thank you so much again, Niklas, for being here today.
Thank you. It was really nice being here. Thanks for the interview.
Thank you.